A group of Ukrainian vehicles, tanks and transports is massing few kilometers off the zero line, because this is how they call the line of contact. They are preparing for a local counterattack. What they don't know, though, is that the Russian Orlan 10 drone is watching them. The Russian operator zooms in, identifies soldiers and vehicles as effectively an enemy unit, he calculates the coordinates, and then he radios the targeting data in to the local artillery headquarters with his 168 Aqueduct radio. A fire mission is assigned to a battery of Tornado 300S. These are 300mm MLRS firing rockets guided by the GPS and featuring mid-course correction. The Orlan operator keeps watching the Ukrainian till multiple explosions erupt around them. This is a generic description of something that must have happened hundreds of times in Ukraine. Yes, because despite all the initial
issues
and all the subsequent issues that the Russian ground forces have demonstrated, yet this kind of mission is always executed very efficiently by the Russian artillery. The reason being, they're using NATO standard equipment. Okay, that's a dramatization obviously, but let me explain. A few months ago, I spent some of the money that very generously patrons, members and other donors give to the channel. And I spent that money to become a RUSI member. For those who don't know, RUSI is a British think tank covering military obviously, but also geostrategic issues. A few weeks ago, RUSI published a long report about Western electronic components in Russian weapons, focusing in particular on semiconductors. And it was a shock. So a RUSI team could examine captured equipment or parts that survived the explosions or the wrecks in search for Western electronic components. And what they could find was unexpected. Or better, the presence of some Western components was indeed expected. It is well known that Soviet Union, but also Russia, have always been very engaged in intelligence activities to acquire Western technology. And since the fall of the Soviet Union, it has become easier for the Russian to actually import components for perfectly legitimate purposes. It was only reasonable to assume that some of them could have found their way into their military equipment despite all the checks and controls and regulations. What surprised pretty much everyone was the scale. The RUSI team could examine 27 modern Russian pieces of equipment and they found 450 different types of Western and Asian components. Many of them essential components for the weapon or the system. The small dramatization at the beginning, which was actually inspired by the RUSI report itself, is a good example of this situation. The Orlan's camera is a Sony. It is mounted on a gimbal produced by the American Hextronics. The autopilot is built around a microcontroller produced by the Italo-French ST Microelectronics. And the engine is a Japanese model aircraft engine. The Aqueduct radio contains a microcontroller from the American Analog Devices and a DSP from Texas Instruments. The rockets fired by the Tornado S contain Western FPGAs and RAM modules. And the list goes on and on and on. And if you read the report, there are several examples that demonstrate how the presence of Western components is really pervasive in Russian weapons. Even the most modern and the most effective are not immune. Just another example, the KH-101, which is the elective weapons of the beautiful Tu-160 White Swan, has demonstrated to be very effective in Ukraine and very precise and quite reliable. While most of the key components of the guidance system are of Western origin, and many of these components were already covered by export limitation before 2014. The RUSI report goes in great detail into explaining how the Russians did procure these components. It was done setting up commercial businesses and intermediaries all around the world. Actually, some of the components that have been found were relatively easy. They were generic commercial components whose military use was not strictly controlled. Others, though, were military-grade components or dual-use components built according to military specifications. This demonstrates how it is practically impossible to control the flow of these components when they are out in the market. Experts can always find a way around rules and regulations. Anyway, we have news that the Russians, since the beginning of the war, are scrambling to procure all the components that they can put their hands on. They're continuously setting up new logistic chains in foreign countries just to procure these critical components. And this brings us to the key question. Will Russia be able to support the war effort by producing an adequate quantity of high-technology weapons? Well, as usual, the answer is it's complicated. First thing to notice is that the flip side of the presence of many important Western components is that all the others are not Western. In fact, Russia and Belarus do have the capability of producing semiconductors. Albeit, obviously, there is a technology gap with the West and an even bigger gap with Taiwan. In fact, it is not by chance that Russian components tend to be larger, heavier, and less power efficient than Western components when implementing the same capability. In very general terms, we can say that the raw processing power is usually lower, so this needs to be compensated with different architectures. This is one of the reasons why Western components were used in place of developing indigenous ones. But there is another and more subtle reason. Many of the weapons that we see in Ukraine now have been designed in the 90s and early 2000s. This was the time when Russia underwent the shock of transitioning from the Soviet-style economy to a market economy. It was a terrible time for Russia. The Russian population suffered enormously. But it was a time when the contrast with the West was at its historic low. So designers at the time thought that they could access these Western components without too much difficulty for the near future. In the economic science, this is a handbook case of comparative advantages. Why build something better in-house when it was relatively easy to buy it abroad? Obviously, now we know that this attitude backfired. In the aftermath of the 2014 events, Russia enacted a legislation to reduce its dependency from international commerce. This has been successfully enacted in several industries, and it is one of the reasons why the current sanctions seem to have an impact that is lower than expected. However, this was not the case for semiconductors and electronic industry in general. Semiconductors are the product of a very high-tech industry. There are very few specialized manufacturers that basically dominate the field. Building a foundry, the actual factory that produces the semiconductors, requires large investments, but is not that difficult. The high technology, though, is in the equipment required by the foundry. The software to design the semiconductors or the lithography machines that are a key step of the production process are really built by a very small number of producers. You can count them on your hand and you will say fingers. If access to those technologies is cut, If access to those suppliers is cut, it is extremely difficult to replicate those technologies. For example, China has heavily invested in the attempt of catching up with the top brands, and the results are hit and miss. Now, when imports become unavailable, substitutions kick in. This is an uncontroversial economic fact. The point is, how long is going to take? Everything else being equal, that is in constance of the kind of loose alliance that Russia has with China, then probably the two countries are at least a couple of decades away from technology parity with the West and Taiwan, and probably another decade away before production-grade semiconductors could trickle into the industry and into the actual products. And obviously, we all hope that the war will be over much sooner. So, most likely, this technology evolution won't be a factor in the Ukrainian events. So there is another possibility, that is an extensive redesign of these weapons to use only Russian or Chinese components. In fact, weapons that in 2014 were in a sufficiently early development stage have been re-engineered with an eye to the availability of the electronic components. This is the case, for example, of the Sukhoi 57 or the Sarmat ICBM. Most of the systems, though, have deeper roots. They were already designed, they were already in production, and it was too late to do this kind of replacement activity, if it is materially possible. Considering the situation, the Russians may well decide that a redesign is due, but this is going to take time, and for the most complex systems, it easily take years. So if I had to guess, we might see some signs of this kind of redesign, re-engineering, maybe at some point next year, but it's going to take time. And again, we all hope that the war is going to end well in advance. So at the end, we are left with just one possibility. The Russians are going to do everything they can to procure these Western components, stockpile them for the future, and use them for the production till something else is going to happen. Until that redesign that we have already mentioned is going to happen, or till there is some technology progress, we are probably going to see the same weapons with the same components, and when those components will be missed and the production will be urgent, we will see makeshift solutions just to fill the gap. And we will see if this is enough to support the war effort. If you got to this point in the video, thank you very much, and an enormous thank you to all those who support the channel on Patreon by being a member or by one-off donations on PayPal. You can also support the channel by buying a model from AR Models. There is an affiliate link below. I will get a small percentage and there will be no extra cost for you. In the meanwhile, though, if you're interested in Russian aerospace, Russian affairs, or anything like that, there are several videos on the channel that are going to appear on the screen beside me. Clicking on those videos is another way of supporting the channel, because you will tell YouTube that these videos are interesting. So, thank you very much for watching, and see you there.